Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. In this video, you're not going to see my ugly mug a whole lot. I've got really zoomed in on the skull so that we can see all the landmarks. I'm going to do my best to show you these as best I can. I got a face made for radio anyway, so who wants to see that? Now, in order to understand this video, you have to have watched the video of me projecting the image of this so that you guys can see sort of the order of things that I want you to learn here. Now, I'm going to sit down. You're going to see my hands. I'm going to remove this and show you some things. This is the calvaria, the roof of the skull. We actually have the skull facing away from us. We remove the calvaria, and I set this underneath here to give you the best angle, but some of the white in the background is messing me up a little bit. So I'm going to remove this. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be learning these holes or openings in the skull and all these bumps. Obviously, when I look here, there's all these little openings in the skull, all these little holes. And I have to tilt the skull in different angles to see them. But ultimately, anytime I look inside the skull from the top or the bottom, the biggest, largest hole in the skull is the first one that we learn. That's your foramen magnum. Now, as I showed or I talked about earlier, if I run my finger from underneath here and run it straight up this wall, my finger will flex over this little ridge here. And there's going to be 4 holes going from the foramen magnum in order to this little ridge. This is called the foramen magnum. This one's called the hypoglossal foramen. And there's 2 of those, one on the right and one on the left. The next one is very large and jagged. That's called the jugular foramen. So magnum, hypoglossal, jugular. And then there's one, if you have a plastic skull, that looks like they tried to drill through, but they really didn't drill it all the way out. And a real human skull, it would go to the outside. That's the magnum, the hypoglossal, the jugular, and internal acoustic. Foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen, jugular foramen or canal, internal acoustic canal or meatus. Now, when I get to this ridge here, which is the petrous part of the temporal bone, we're going to cover that in a minute, I really have to tilt the skull backwards in order to see these openings here. This opening right here is called the carotid canal. That's the first one over the ridge from the internal acoustic or internal auditory. I fall straight into that one. That one's called the carotid canal. And there's a little groove connecting it to this one, which is right next to our sella turcica. That is the foramen lacerum. And that's the funny saying that we came up with. My husband Joe is a creative lover. Magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, internal acoustic, carotid, lacerum. And then put the foramen or whatever with the rest of the name. Foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen, jugular foramen, internal acoustic meatus or internal acoustic canal, or internal auditory meatus or internal auditory canal. Right over the ridge would be the carotid canal and the foramen lacerum on either side of the sella turcica here. Now, if I'm at the foramen lacerum, if I go to the side of that, there's 2 small holes here. A little tiny one, and then a nice oval one on either side. That tiny one is called the foramen spinosum, and the oval one is the foramen ovale. Now, in order to see the remainder of these, because this is part of the sphenoid that I referred to as the greater wing, you don't need to know that, but the greater wing goes this way and then it curves up underneath this little part called the lesser wing of the sphenoid. So if I tilt the skull so that I'm looking right over the back edge, there's a nice little round hole that appears there. That's the foramen rotundum. I can see these 2 little points from part of the lesser wing of the sphenoid, and right underneath that ridge, there's a hole that runs through here. And if I rotate the skull, it's that large crack in the orbit. So let me do that again. Let me run it through there. This large opening in the orbit is called the superior orbital fissure. And we can see it from the front or the back. It's right underneath that little point. Now, if I go over that point, that little hole there on either side is the optic canal. And the optic canal also comes out. It's the round hole in the orbit. Okay? So we could ask it from the front, or we could ask it from the back. So that's the SORS. S is spinosum, O is ovale, R is rotundum, And then the other S is the superior orbital fissure. And then we have the optic, spinosum ovale rotundum, superior orbital fissure, which you may not be able to see. I can't see what y'all can see through this camera. I wish I had a monitor. And then there's the two optic canals, okay? So, foramen spinosum, foramen ovale, foramen rotundum, the superior orbital fissure, and the optic canals. That's all 11. You should practice them in small groups and then see if you can do them all. Foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen, jugular foramen, internal acoustic canal or internal auditory meatus, however it's written on the list, the carotid canal, and the foramen lacerum. If I move out laterally, it's foramen spinosum, foramen ovale. I tilt the skull forward, foramen rotundum. If I tilt it right, you can see the superior orbital fissure, and then there's the optic canal. If I did it on the other side, it's the same thing. Magnum, hypoglossal, jugular, foramen magnum, hypoglossal foramen, jugular foramen, internal acoustic canal or meatus. If I go over the hole and tilt it back, I have the carotid canal, the foramen lacerum, spinosum, and ovale. Foramen spinosum, foramen ovale. If I tilt it forward, I see the the foramen rotundum, the superior orbital fissure, and then over here would be the optic. I have 11 going one way, 11 going the other. Okay? Now, if I run my finger on the front edge of the skull here and I fall just inside the skull, it's going to land on a little spike all the way down here that on either side has a little groove. That little spike sticking up is called the crista galli. The little groove on either side of that is called the cribriform plate. If I run straight down here, you can see these 2 points and this bar going across, but you can see how three-dimensional it is. I can stick my finger down in there. So this whole thing is called the sella turcica, and the middle bottom of the sella turcica is called the hypophyseal fossa. Crista galli, cribriform plate. Sella turcica, hypophyseal fossa. This ridge right here, this thick ridge, is part of the temporal bone. You can see how thick it is. And it's like a giant rock called the petrous part. And then this flat wall over here would be called the squamous part of the temporal bone. Okay? So that's all of the internal structures of the skull. We only have a few structures left, and I'm going to cover them right now. If I turn the skull sideways, one of the first things I can see is the zygomatic arch. Just posterior to the arch in the temporal bone is a giant opening here or hole. That one's called the external auditory meatus or external auditory canal or external acoustic meatus or external acoustic canal. It goes by all 4 names. But that's the external auditory canal. This large bump behind that is called the mastoid process. This is the mastoid process. And if I look very closely, there's a little sharp piece sticking down here. The word stylus means needle, and that is called the styloid process. So external auditory meatus or canal, mastoid process, styloid process. Now look, if I snap the mandible off, this is the mandibular condyle. And the head of the condyle fits in this little rubber piece here. And if I look from underneath, that little rubber piece is where there's a little fossa. That's called the mandibular fossa. And then I have these 2 little bumps sticking up right here. They're part of the occipital bone at the front edge of the foramen magnum. And they're little rounded bumps that the skull sits on so you can nod your head. Those 2 little bumps are called condyles. They're called the occipital condyles. Okay? So, external auditory meatus, mastoid process, styloid process, mandibular fossa, occipital condyles. Finally, and the hardest thing for students to get at this point, the zygomatic arch here is made up of 2 parts. The temporal bone has a zygomatic process, this little piece right here that sticks up from the temporal bone to this little suture line. And I know you can't see that suture line very well, and I don't like to write on the models, but I am going to draw this one in real quick. I don't know if you'll be able to see it or not on the video. I can erase that later. But that little suture line from here to that line is called the temporal process, it's called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now, this little bone right here is the zygomatic bone. If I cover it up, there's still a little piece that sticks out from the zygomatic bone. That is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So the temporal bone has a zygomatic process, the zygomatic bone has a temporal process, and those two together all the way across makes the zygomatic arch. I'm going to repeat it one more time. The temporal bone has a zygomatic process, the zygomatic bone has a temporal process, and together those make the zygomatic arch. So look, external auditory meatus, mastoid process, styloid process, mandibular fossa, occipital condyle. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone, the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Now, if you follow along our list of things to know, while we did not go in order, we have covered everything on the list on page 17 and 18, all the way through, and we've even covered the mandible. I'll show you the hyoid in the future, and we'll do the paranasal sinuses in the future. And then we're not going to study the fontanelles. You'll learn those if you have to. So we are done learning the skull. I hope you guys had as much fun as I did. I hope you learned this very well. I hope you break it in small chunks and practice it. Study it till you can't stand it. Study it till you understand it, and study it until you can teach it to someone else. And then do it 5 more times just to be sure, so that you can make the highest grade possible. If you're going to be good at anything in life worth doing, you have to work hard at it. Whether it's football, volleyball, baseball, it takes 1,000 tries to get it right. The same is true with anatomy and physiology. So make sure that you study this stuff hard, you study it often, you study it well, so that you guys can learn it and make your A's on your tests. Okay? Anyway, enough of you watching me fumble with that. I hope you had as much fun as I did. We're going to do the remainder of the skeleton in the future. Thanks for watching.